So James, can you tell us what people brought to you while you were at the back there a second ago?
Hi everyone, morning. We had UK politics, why can't they collaborate? What does it mean for the political party reform to have a Christian element to it? What are the implications for the Church of England of the new Archbishop having a safeguarding kind of cloud around her? Can we trust mainstream media? How can the Nativity be relevant today? How can Christianity and nationalism be together? Those were the ones that were brought to me whilst I was in the lobby. We had a few. Will AI replace God by 2030? Was the other one. That's a bit of an outlier in terms of those others. Nothing wrong with it. So yeah, that's where we got to.
Brilliant. Just put my glass in. So when we sat at the front there, we looked at all of those, and a kind of theme emerged very quickly, which is in and around of what happens if your culture is shifting, and what is going on. So James, you came up with the phrase like, how do powers respond to kind of a more of an increase in kind of the Christian faith or interest in the Christian faith? So I quickly wrote down this question: what if the tide is coming back in? So what if the tide of faith is coming back in? And then we very, very, on the emphasis on very, very quickly mapped out a quick journey through some things around that. So does that sound, so that will pick up on things like the politics question, culture, and discipleship of people not like us. A few nods? I can't see. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Reason,
and just before we do it, in case you missed it, the reason why we do this is we recognise that Christianity has moved to the margins within our society, and so in order for people to come to faith, to grow in faith, and to exist as Christians in a different culture, we need to educate people in more than just what we do on a Sunday morning. We need to give you an understanding of what a Christian worldview looks like and how we engage as disciples when we are in the world and the rest of the week. And of course, we try to do that in our Sunday morning teachings. But actually, what we're doing here is we're picking up on issues in the world and then bringing them into Christian theology. Whereas on a Sunday morning, generally speaking, when we're preaching, we're taking an issue from the Scriptures and taking it into the issues that come out of the Scriptures. So this is why we do this regularly. We're passionate about you not kind of stumbling across ethical issues in the world and thinking, how do I think about that as a Christian? But understanding the kind of the framework behind it.
And then, so I think it's a kind of introduction to this one, like kind of the things that are flying around in the background are, so in March, the Bible Society produced a report called The Quiet Revival, in which they've been tracking with YouGov a whole load of people, and they basically say there's this massive uptick in interest in spirituality, and that there's, especially in younger generations, especially younger men, and this is being seen in all denominations, although interestingly enough, the denomination that's being seen the least in is the Church of England. The Quiet Revival has been, the two aspects to say about it is, number one is, I think in some fair measure it's been critiqued to say that some of their numbers don't add up, so there should be, the sheer numbers of additional people that there should be in a Catholic church, for example, on a Sunday morning aren't seen. However, the themes behind it are true, that actually anecdotally people in churches where there is faith or experiencing people coming having almost kind of converted already. Yeah. You've had that kind of experience in Alpha this term, and seeing that uptick in younger people, and we've heard that kind of from our youth work as well. And actually, interestingly enough, the Church of England has been very, very quick to go, oh, this isn't really real, because we measure our numbers, and the Bible Society responded and said, well, have a look at your adult baptism figures for the last year, because actually they're the highest they've been for a very, very long time. Why is that? So that's that one. You've then got Tommy Robinson, who, James, you can remember his real name.
I can't, but I've got it written down. Where is it?
So while James, Stephen sort of double... thank you, somebody said it. But he's come out of prison, and he's been led...
Stephen Yaxley Lennon.
And he has been led to faith by a chaplain in prison.
Ricky Doolan.
And there's been a whole thing around the kind of rise of Christian nationalism in our culture and in our country, and a rise in an interest in terms of like claiming Christ back for the culture and claiming Christ back for Christianity. And last week, Tommy Robinson held a carol service in the open air in Westminster, which actually a friend of mine went to. And he has, the range of responses to him has varied from the Church of England bishops releasing a statement kind of basically calling him out completely and saying...
Yeah, any co-opting or corrupting of the Christian faith to exclude others is unacceptable.
My understanding is they've done that without meeting with him. So you've got that going down. You've also got a really interesting dynamic, which is there's been some research done that they expect that something like 85% of Church of England attendees will vote either Reform or Conservative at the next general election. That actually church generally, but the Church of England generally leans to the right, and you've got this kind of leadership that leans to the left, and reform, and we've always done a whole thing. So Alistair Campbell famously told Tony Blair that we don't do God. So Blair is a Christian, and Campbell said the one thing we don't talk about ever is God, and yet reform are leaning into that. So Danny Kruger, who I was going to say defected, but left the Conservative Party to join the Reform, is very clear about his Christian faith. And last week there was a carol service in Westminster for a Reform carol service, which their MPs and their kind of key leaders were involved in, and they're actually leaning into Christianity ahead of the next generation. So all of that is kind of in the background.
And there are multiple podcasts around this issue that we would want to do. So if you want to be here this afternoon, we can probably record about 4 of them. But actually, we've probably both got other stuff we need to do.
We came up before. I came up with a 5th one, but I can't.
Did you?
Yeah.
So we just want to acknowledge at this. I want to acknowledge at this moment that Stephen Yaxley then and Tommy Robinson is known as somebody who has got an anti-Islamic rhetoric in his past, and there's a whole set of podcasts that we could do. One especially around the conversion of St. Paul and what conversion looks like and how conversion changes the way that you do theology, and not just the way you do theology, but you engage with people who think differently to you. And I want to acknowledge that this is a place where we have people who've converted from Islam. This is a place of welcome for people from all nations. And so what we would want you to hear clearly is that whilst we think there's something going on here that we need to not close ourselves off to, we just want to be really clear that in the way that I would seek to engage with my friends who are Muslims, it isn't with a kind of perception from the outside at least, that needs to involve any form of aggression or incitement to hatred. So we just want to put that marker down in the way that we communicate, because in the past we've communicated around these issues and we've not kind of put the disclaimers in that make it possible for people to hear what it is that we're bringing.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think each of the points we're now going to go into is probably a podcast in itself. Here's point number 1. Turn to the person next to you, look them in the eye and say, I live in a bubble.
I live in a bubble. Which one was it? We've got the right drinks.
Yeah. We're mixing our coffees, have we?
Yeah.
So here is the first thing we all need to hear. It is, as James, we've talked about it before, this is a podcast about culture. Culture is the way we do things, and it's the way we understand stuff, and so much of that is assumed. So in my wife's family, nobody ever shouts, because they're polite and English and middle class. And in my family, because we're Irish, everybody shouts. And actually, when you take somebody from one culture into the other person is completely discombobulated. But you don't realize that about yourself until you're taken out of your comfort zone. And so the first thing is, wherever you sit politically, you will have assumptions, and you will have assumptions about faith and about God, some of which may not be correct. And that's every single one of you. Okay? And I'm including me in that.
Oh, I thought we were exempt.
And I'm going to read, so here is Joshua chapter 5, reading from verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him and a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, Are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, What message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Tim Keller makes the point that Jesus is neither left nor right, in that actually there are values that the left hold that are deeply Christian and values that the left hold that are deeply anti-Christian. And the values that the right hold that are deeply Christian and are values that are actually also anti-Christian. And Keller's point is that in all the stuff of your life, if you are following a Jesus who does not challenge your assumptions or some of your political leanings or some of your thinking around how you do things, then you're probably not following the Jesus of Scripture. And that actually he is the Lord of all, and that the response to him in a moment like this, Joshua's about to try and take a first battle, is actually to fall in awe and reverence before a holy God. And what we tend to do is in cultures is to co-opt Jesus to our agenda. We do that as parents, we do that in the workplace, we do that as whole cultures. And what we need to learn to do is to pay attention to our assumptions and our beliefs and allow this book to challenge them. I'm going to do number 2 in a second. My tutor, theology tutor, basically said, when I turned up to do theology, said, you have a field full of sacred cows. And he smiled. He said, my job over the next couple of years is to help you give every cow a really good kick. And at the end of the 3 years, make sure the right ones are still standing. And so actually all the way through life, we need to remember this, that Jesus is neither left nor is he right. He is above us. He is the Lord of all. And before him, our first response is to bow in reverence and awe, and then actually let him challenge our hearts about our assumptions and about what we think.
Yeah, so just to put that into practicality, there's a guy called John Mark Comer who's involved in a church in LA who did a sermon on this about 5 years ago, and he said, for example, that there are key ethics within the extremities of the left and right in the States that don't fall on either side of Christian thinking. So if you weigh up what the early church thought and did, for example, the radical care for the poor and the integration of people from different ethnic backgrounds was part of the early church's life, as was a commitment to the sanctity of life and the preservation of marriage as monogamous. And he says, if you look at American politics, the first two fall on the left and the second two fall on the right, and how actually what we're called to as a church is not to sit in a world where we go, well, it's this or this, but to say actually it's the gospel, and it's what the gospel brings to society that we want to stand up for.
Brilliant. I'm just going to... we need to own this and we need to be open to our own hearts, but everybody suffers from it. So the non-Christian book to read is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree on Religion and Politics. And basically, he likens it to like somebody who listens to Radio 1 trying to talk to somebody who listens to Radio 3, and it missing on the airways, because actually you start with a different set of values. And that and that's a really interesting book, because actually it's not just Christians or anybody of faith who will do this. We all do it. We all start our ethical thinking with a set of kind of like sort of values that we hold almost sacrosanct, and then from there
why would you listen to Radio 1?
Because I'm down with the kids, James.
Excellent. Do I do Niebuhr now, or is that...
Yeah, Niebuhr is number 2.
So there's a theologian called Niebuhr, Niebuhr, who wrote a book called Christ and Culture, and just would really encourage you to get your head around the 5 models that he talks about of the relationship between Christ and culture. So culture is a word that expresses both the world that is good, that God looks at in Genesis and says this is good, and the world that is fallen, that God has sent his son to save because he loves, but we're also not to trust. And culture is a word within our language that holds all of that together, the good and the bad, and it appears differently in different places. And what Niebuhr says is that essentially there are 5 different ways that the church is related to culture. So there's Christ against culture, which is we're reacting to everything that culture brings. So if you think of the most extreme example of that would be the Amish and the Mennonites, who would go off and live and create essentially a different culture and react against the culture of the world. If you think of Christ of culture, so that would be the desire. Like if you think of in its most extreme and defunct form would be like an adaptation of everything that the culture brings before it. and a failure to correct it. Most normally, like my wife Nikki's got a wonderful story of American Christians meeting Fijian Christians, and Fijian Christians not understanding why American Christians would smoke, and American Christians not understanding why Fijian Christians would have tattoos. So they're bringing their different cultures and the things that haven't necessarily been challenged in the way that they're following Jesus. And so a Christ of culture model allows Christ to over-affirm what is in the culture before Christ gets there. Then you've got Christ above culture. A classic would be kind of Thomas Aquinas, who would say that the philosophy of Plato and others helps culture to be more perfect. And so there is thinking in the world and in the gospel that enables culture to almost be elevated beyond itself. But it doesn't necessarily deal with the stuff that's going on in culture. Christ and culture in paradox is this sense that that actually we're never going to change culture, and there is just this jarring between us and culture, but we want to almost like we want to engage, and we want to be a faithful presence without expecting a Christianizing of culture. But the weakness is it can kind of turn into withdrawal or a passivity. And the last is the transformation of culture. So the desire that grace leads us into the culture and wants us to change it for good and wants to see Christ at the heart of it, and the active pursuit of justice, reform, and mission. But its weakness is that it can become too wedded to the culture and turn into a kind of either a triumphalism if it works, or a kind of a lukewarmness because it's getting washed down.
Brilliant. And I'm going to cite, actually, Tim, I didn't write this down. I'm going to cite Tim Keller again. Every culture is slightly different. And the gospel challenges and affirms aspects of every culture in a kind of a unique way. So Keller talked about how if you take Christian doctrines, that cultures they don't know they do this, but we'll kind of rank them A, B, and C. So an A culture, an A doctrine is something that we say in the Christian faith, that culture just sticks its thumb up. And so he talks about how in the West, the idea that God is love and those who live in love live in God is a massive A doctrine. Nobody will disagree with you on the fact that God is love.
If they believe in God.
If they believe in God, thank you. He said, but the idea that there is justice and that Jesus is coming again to judge, he said, in the West, actually, because of our philosophical leanings, that's definitely a C culture. We don't want to hear about that and we don't want to talk about it. But he said if you go to other places, and he'd spent some time talking to a guy called Miroslav Volf about this, that actually there are some places where that third one, which is the one that we find appalling in the West, the idea that there might be a judge who will put all things right, is actually an A culture. If you are, if you're from a persecuted nation, or if you're from a nation that's been colonized, or you're from a place in the world where your neighbors have been fighting over your land all this time, the idea that God might step in and sort everything out is a massive A culture. But the idea that God might love everybody and the people who've been causing you, and you spent some time in South Sudan, the people that who've been like murdering your wives and your children and would be forgiven, is a C culture. And Keller's point is that whenever we as Christians begin to talk to our cultures and engage with our cultures, we need to build bridges. And you build bridges with the A doctrines. So you build bridges by saying, yes, God loves everybody. But then you begin to, once you've got the weight of the bridge down, you can then begin to point out that actually, but love without justice isn't really love at all. And you share, and I did this in a sermon a while, you share stories about how actually love is motivated to fight for justice. And you begin to do that. Or you might say that there is a God who is going to judge, and that God is going to basically see everything right, but that God is also going to do it in love. And so Keller's whole point is that what we have to do constantly as Christians is try and read our culture, learn our culture, and then begin to communicate and build bridges to our culture so that we can then proclaim the fullness of the gospel. Does that make sense?
And so this is challenging because as people, if we go back to the tide coming in, if the idea is that the tide is coming in and the tide of faith is coming in from a culture that has not been Christian, then what does it mean for it to come to Christ? What does it mean for it to be reconciled to Jesus in all its fullness? And what does it mean for us who have been trying to live counterculturally to engage with people who are coming out of a culture where their behaviors and their attitudes might not yet have been reconciled to Christ. Did anyone manage when they became a Christian to get it all perfect within a couple of weeks? Right. So we're all a work in progress. So how do we deal with people who are work in progress, who are coming from a different culture?
That's, we're doing all right. So that's Jesus reframed.
Were you doing all right theologically or for time or both?
Oh, I think both.
Great.
I'm now trying to rack my brains. I once had to do this where I was basically halfway through a sermon and I made a point and I was using a ladder as an illustration. I climbed up the ladder and I realized that my New Testament tutor from Oxford was sat in the back row and I panicked.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
didn't fall off. I was there for that.
I was like, oh no, what have I got this wrong? The next thing, so Jesus reframes everything.
Yeah.
We've got to engage with culture
and work out how we're engaging.
And how we engage with culture.
Yeah.
But then, if the tide was coming back in, the thing that's going to happen is, and this is that both the people we don't expect and, if we're honest, the people we don't like are going to become Christians. The people we don't expect and the people we don't like are going to become Christians. And all you need to do is read the book of Acts, and the guy who's the star of it is the number one character.
Jesus. Jesus is the star of Acts.
Jesus. So the best supporting actor award goes to Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you, James. Now we've gone off on a sticky ground theologically. So Paul is that guy. He's the guy the church definitely don't like, and he's the guy they don't expect, and he gets converted.
Imagine the PCC meeting in Jerusalem when they find out that Paul's converted on his way to Damascus. Can you imagine that? Minutes of the last meeting. Any matters arising? Yes, the guy who had the coats laid at his feet when Stephen was killed has just become a Christian. And, they didn't have that language at that point. Has become a follower of the way. He got blinded on the road to Damascus.
There we go. So the first thing I'm going to say is I don't know Tommy Robinson. And I'm not going to make any judgments about his conversion. I feel like a lot of people are making judgments about his conversion who, my understanding is they haven't spent any time with him. And that would be the first thing I want us all to hear is let's never judge anybody, but especially stories of conversion until we have, and there's a couple of other aspects as well, but until we know that someone has spent time with them, until their story has been heard, and until their life has been seen over many years. I think that's the first thing to say. My best friend from university's father was an evangelist who went into prisons in the UK and Poland, and he said that and we've worked with ex-offenders in this church. He said prison is a really dark place, and prison is a place where actually Jesus comes close. And he said, and a lot of people in prison encounter Jesus more than we realize. A lot of people in prison give their lives to Jesus, probably more than we realize. And then he said two things. He said, number one is the story of the sower is true. And we know it's true in our own lives as well, is that actually there is different types of soil. And that happens with people in prison. And he said, and number two is if the church fails, and it fails in all sorts of areas, the group of people that we fail most in society, and then I think we slightly ape it in church, is people who come out of prison because we don't know what to do with them and because we're slightly scared of them. And that is part of the problem that we have as church. So people can encounter, this is my friend's dad would say, encounter Jesus in prison, and when they come out, the church doesn't quite know how to deal with them, doesn't quite know how to disciple them and help them, and they don't know how to, they've never had lives passed into them to know how to live as we live. And so he said, and then what we then do is we don't cut them enough slack in their new lives. Yeah. And so I'm not going to judge Tommy Robinson because I don't know him. Yeah. And I don't haven't spent any time with him.
I've got a few things to say on that one. He testifies to a living faith in Jesus. Grace is offensive. Grace is offensive. And it is. Jesus tells a story about that. The guy coming at the 11th hour, Paul, his conversion would have been offensive to the people in Jerusalem. Grace is offensive. And if you're offended by just the statement that he testifies to a living faith in Jesus, then there's probably some pride in your heart that you need to deal with before the Lord about what it means to be saved by grace through faith in the work of Jesus. So grace is offensive. And then I guess that thing. Actually, we want to treat him like a brother, but I think there's a gap between Paul's conversion and his public ministry. And so I think everyone should be a little bit cautious about the absence of a gap between conversion and public ministry in his life, because we would say that anyone who gets released into public ministry should be properly prepared for it. And so I think we can have right concern about the absence of that gap, and pray, therefore, for those around him, that they would pray that they would be able to speak into that he might be able to reflect on what has gone on for him and let Jesus reframe everything for him.
And then there's a couple of things to say in terms of actually when somebody comes to faith. So the illustration in my head is before we come to faith in Jesus, we're all a house that needs to find a new owner. And when Jesus, it's C.S. Lewis's illustration, when Jesus gets hold of your house, he starts remodeling it.
Yeah.
And it's a process that will take between now and eternity. And he's a careful and he's a gentle remodeler because he doesn't want to destroy you. And some of us come to faith and we do need rewiring completely, but our electricity looks almost Christian. And we don't realize that it needs rewiring. And some of us come to faith, and actually the house is like the house, some of us have those houses in the street where somebody hasn't lived for years. And we know it looks like that. And I've been challenged in my own heart about this, is we expect somebody to come to faith and almost get to my kind of middle class Christian cultural set of values almost straight away, when actually some people have come to faith, they've not had a parent, they've grown up in dysfunction, they've had all this kind of stuff, and we expect them to get here so quickly. And actually Jesus is so kind and generous and gracious with each and every one of us that he works at the speed that our hearts need to come to faith. And so we need to always realize that as people, when we all come to faith from where we're at, and God, he's going to work in us.
Yeah. It's about repentance and transformation.
And then there's a couple of things, I think, to say. So there's a lot of people who've been down on Tommy Robinson because they said he's still saying some of the stuff he said. John Newton, who campaigned vociferously for the ending of the slave trade, who basically wouldn't let Wilberforce give up. When he was converted, his first move was to stop working on the ships, but to become the master of the tides in Liverpool. And one of the sadnesses in his life, it took him, I'm not going to quote the number of years, but it took him X amount of years before it dawned to him that the slave trade needed to be ended. And yet this is the man who wrote Amazing Grace. That actually it took a number of years of faithful discipleship in his life to move from a situation of I shouldn't be working in the slave trade to this needs to end. And so actually we know that in our lives, and actually as we move. And so the person I know who went to the Tommy Robinson carol service said actually he noted an absence of flags compared to what everybody expected. He noticed ethnic diversity, including the person who was leading the worship, and he noticed a whole load of readings and people preaching about Jesus. And so he said, actually, for me, the first signs of discipleship were there. And so actually we need to pray that this is what's happening, as opposed to go, oh, I think he's, straight away trying to use this for his own political ends. And we need to do that. And then the Bible is very clear that if somebody comes to faith, that their life will exhibit the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, kindness, patience, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And actually, again, it's something that grows. And it'll be all of those, a concatenation, to use Jonathan Edwards' term, that grows over time. And so actually, when someone comes to faith, like we think about Jonathan Aiken about 20-something years ago, that over time we will see the fruit of the Spirit grow, and we will see change, and we will see them begin to reassess some of their stuff. And so we don't judge from afar, and we trust that what the book says about what happens in someone's life, we see to happen.
Are we doing 4 now?
We can do 4.
Yeah. So I can't read your handwriting.
Loss of the idols
and control.
The response of the powers. Do you want?
Yeah. So I think I think what you mean by this, but I may be wrong, correct me, is that if we're in a position of stability, we can all create our own kind of control. The moment that stability is affected by external forces, our sense of control is threatened. That would be true in any kind of environment. But particularly in this setting, if there is a rise in faith, what does that do to us? So just, we like doing this. We like doing Morty Vicar. We can witter on for a long time. You can see that this morning. Actually, a way of communicating with people who are coming to faith is to communicate in shorter, sharper ways than we do. We have to let go of some of our own idols, potentially, in order to communicate accurately into a setting where we think there's probably loads of content that isn't necessarily helpful for people. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to let our own idols go? We're going to have to work that one out. You can extrapolate that up and go, how do bishops who have fought for issues like migration, anti-racism stuff, how do they deal with being leaders of a national institution when they see a movement coming that is threatening some of their own idols? So when a force is coming in from the outside, it just shows up the stuff in our own hearts that we don't like. What if the Lord sent 200 people to B&A over the next couple of years who are not Christians as part of a revival? How would your seat, you might not be able to sit in your favourite pew. You can have a favourite pew.
Hopefully I'm going to get you to be able to buy it at some point.
What about your time and how you'd use your time? How would you be? Would you have as much time with your friends that you would have before? When God moves, he challenges the idols of all of our hearts. And the question is, are we willing to let him challenge those idols so that we can get involved in what he's doing? Or are we going to sit on the sidelines and say, actually, I'm more comfortable where I am, thanks very much?
One of the sadnesses of a man called R.T. Kendall, who was the minister of Westminster Chapel in London, is that when the Toronto Blessing came, they had an opportunity to, I might get the story wrong, but I think I either had an opportunity to go and to see it or to bring them in. And they had an elders meeting. And the elders were like, no, this is not how the Lord moves. And so R.T. Kendall said, I knew I had to honour my elders. And if you know the story, that literally, it's a 5-minute walk down the road, is Holy Trinity Brompton, who the vicar there went, yes. And that caused an awful lot of ruckus at the time because it didn't look like church should look. It didn't, it caused all sorts of bad press. And yet they knew the Lord was in it and they welcomed it. And my favourite story is the person in charge of media there was once met the vicar as they were queuing out of the building to come in. And he said, I'm really a bit stressed. The Times of London are here, the Telegraph is here, BBC is here. And the vicar just paused and said, but is the Lord here? He said, because that's all I'm interested in. And that when he shows up, he tends to do things a little bit differently. And that's repeatedly. Wesley had to stop preaching in Church of England churches because they wouldn't let him preach in Church of England churches, primarily because of the message he preached and what happened in terms of the spiritual while he preached. And so he ended up, the world is my parish. And the Church of England took about another 120 years before the impact of the method of Whitfield and Wesley's revival came into the life of the Church of England. And it was a bunch of people who were like, this is not how God should operate. And about 15 years ago, I was in a church where there was a move of the Spirit beginning. And there was a few of us on staff who were kind of charismatic. And the vicar pulled the three of us into a meeting and just said, I want to talk to the three of you. And he said, I want you to know that God is on the move in this church and that the Spirit is going to fall. And then he said, I want you to hear one thing very clearly, that it won't look like you expect. And you need to be open to that or you will miss it. And he said, and then he smiled. He said, but you will know it's him because you know him. But this sense, that we carry like the assumptions about how everything should be done. And that actually when he moves, it's consistent with the book, but it'll be different. And that's why our idols get pushed over in moves of God. The things that we've put in our life that kind of sit alongside our faith in Jesus and the idols of culture. And we need to let him do that because what he has is always better.
Yeah. I love to be known and love to know everyone's names. It's not going to work. It's not going to work if revival happens. I can't do that. So I've got to lay that down. There'll be stuff for all of us if the Lord's on the move. So there's a loss of control, but there's also, as we let go of stuff, there's something about how do we join in. So if we're thinking about Christ transforming culture and how we can transform a culture that's coming into the church, we've got to think about how do we do that. We don't just listen to ourselves. So there's a few other resources that we are listening to regularly, one of which is a guy called Glenn Scrivener and Speak Life, who I would recommend to everyone. And he last week interviewed somebody who had been a far-right activist and had come to faith 6 years ago and has been on a journey coming to an awareness of what it means to follow Jesus and has repented of some stuff. And he tells a story in an interview with Glenn Scrivener of making the decision to go to the carol service, filling up his rucksack with tracts that he could then hand out in the crowd and lead people to faith in Jesus. And I think that's a really good picture of what it means to be in relationship with a culture that is coming to faith in Jesus, which is we're going to actively choose to make ourselves present in that and to lead people to Jesus and to show them what it means to follow him. You don't have to have a rucksack full of tracts, but I think it's a picture that can inform the way that we might relate.
Brilliant. So what if the tide was coming back in? I think if the tide was coming back in, the people who will respond both in the church and outside of the church are the same types of people that we're going to read about this week in the gospel story. They're all the wrong people. Headline news for Christmas Day sermon. You know, it's a young girl who's pregnant and isn't yet married. It's smelly shepherds on a hillside. It's foreigners from the east. It's not the kings in the palace, and it's not the religious leaders, but it's people whose hearts are open to what God is doing. You know, early in the story, we meet Simeon and Anna, who've just basically been waiting and waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the minute he turns up, not as a conquering king, but as a small baby, they get it. They get it. My eyes have seen thy glory. Now let thy servant depart in peace. And so I think that's the invitation in this season is to have open, soft hearts that are thinking, but that are, Lord, what are you doing? Who are you drawing in? And how can I be used?